Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for the LEC Winter Split Playoffs Round Number 1 overview and analysis video. It is finally best of 3 time. It is finally actually Fearless Draft time. I know obviously there's been all the memes in the community about the best of 1 Fearless, but it is actually finally time to start jumping into these best of 3s to see what these teams are actually made of. Best of 1s are fine to get an initial idea of where these teams stand in terms of, strengths and weaknesses, but at the end of the day, you don't really know how good a team is until they enter some best of 3s, until you can see what happens when they have to adjust throughout the concept of an entire series, when they're going up against a team that is specifically planning the entire week for them. Obviously, a lot on the line for round number 1. Everybody starts in winner's bracket. Winning it immediately takes you into round 2, which we will kind of already cover in today's video, at least the upper bracket round 2. And then, of course, if you lose, you go down into lower bracket. You expend your extra life, if you will, to move further along. So a lot to go over. We'll know our first 2 teams to qualify for the best of 5 stage, that being winners finals, by the end of this video, because we're going to be going through basically the entire upper bracket best of 3 stage. So I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. Did every series go according to plan? Did you have any surprises? Were you shocked by any of the outcomes? Were you surprised by any of the performances from individual players or teams? Would always love to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions down below. Of course, if you want to check out my thoughts on the regular season, check out the playlist up in the iCard, but without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the video, we will be looking over the bracket, talking about where I think teams could be moving in the future. Again, we're already going to know our first 2 teams to qualify for the, actual playoffs, like the best of 5 stage, the top 4 by the end of this video. We will also know which teams are going to be on the brink of elimination, who's going to have to play for their lives going into next week, who's going to have to make a pretty big comeback in order to get themselves into the top 4. A lot of stuff is going to be found out here today in the top 8. So let's get right into it. We've got a lot of series to cover, 6 best of 3s in total to cover in today's video, and that starts off with our biggest seed disparity in round number 1. It's the top seed, the number 1 team from the regular season in Fnatic, taking on Team Heretics, and this one went entirely predictably. Fnatic just absolutely cruises to a victory. Not really a difficult proposition for them. They are the better team, and it's not particularly close between these 2 teams, and honestly, if this had went any other way, I would have been a bit more concerned. Team Heretics, not a good team. I think they're much closer to being like in the bottom 3 section of the LEC than they are to being around like the 7th or 6th best team in the league. I just don't really feel all that confident in Heretics, and I think if Rogue and SK Gaming were even remotely playable, then Heretics probably does not make the top 8. They probably are out like those 2 teams are right now, but they had some interesting pieces in the regular season. They had a couple of players who I think were fine, generally speaking, and, they ended up sneaking in here to the playoffs, but this is, again, the result that everybody anticipated. It's not just Heretics struggling, it's Fnatic looking so darn good at basically every part of the game. Yes, they make one Otacon mistake in this series, but basically outside of that, this is another perfect series coming in from them, and it's exactly what you could have wanted to see. Like, it's just all the players that you needed to see step up, actually stepping up and dominating. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series is, at least obviously to me, gonna go to Karmine on the top side. I didn't even really have to think about this all that much. So much pressure put onto Karmine, so much like aggression from the side of Team Heretics put onto trying to make sure that Gnar was in a bad position. And no matter how much they threw at him, no matter how many resources they put into making that, something they prioritized, it just was never going to happen. Karmine with an absolutely gorgeous Gnar game, getting no resources from his team, getting absolutely no help, and yet still coming out on top, being the better top laner by an absolute country mile, and being probably the most impactful player in this entire game. Now, I certainly don't want to discredit what players like Upset and Razork were able to do throughout the back half of this game, because they were also very relevant at the end of game number 2, but Oscar was the standout player. He was the one that I think the camera was panning to constantly, and he was the star of the team in this game. He has been really, really good so far to start the winter split. I've kind of pumped the brakes a little bit on the Oscar train. I've always been lower on Oscar. I know people are, constantly talking on Reddit and just generally in LEC communities with the like, oh, what does Oscar have to do in order to be considered a top 3 top laner? Not lose super hard. Like, I get the wins are great. Like, it's awesome to see him, win these games and really dominate in the ways that he does. He has to cut back on a lot of the bad games that he has. So far, that's been true in 2025. The bad games have really not existed at all for Karmine. He's performed like a top 3 top laner so far to start 2025. I'm excited to see if that can carry over. The problem is that we have kind of seen this script before from Oscar, where he'll play really well for one split, and then the next split he'll come out and just be kind of average again, and you just have to live with that. Like, that's just something that, you know, exists within Oscar. Hopefully this is the turnaround, though. Like, this is kind of the, we'll just say apex of this stage of his career, where he can start to ascend into that upper echelon. We've seen top laners take some time to grow out of their more aggressive habits and, you know, start growing into being better weak side players. Broken Blade, I think, is the best example of that. It took him quite a few years to become a good weak side player. He was never even remotely playable in that role until he went to G2. Before that, it was just he had to play strong side or else he was going to completely run down games, and Oscar at times I think has been a similar style of player where you put a lot of resources into him and sometimes he just isn't able to survive that. But he is clearly showing improvement in that area, and he has been awesome mechanically to start off this year. Again, very easily a top 2, top 3 top laner in terms of performance to start 2025. You just want to see him be able to keep it up. And then, like I said, Upset and Razork, definitely the 2 other players that I think really stood out to me here. Upset was awesome. He's playing so aggressive. He's playing so greedy right now. This is what you want to see out of an AD carry. You don't want to see the passive version of him that relies on his team to set things up for him. There are a lot of AD carries that will just kill you on sight, right? And understand the value of poking someone out, even if it means sacrificing a bit of health themselves, because they have more to give in fights. Like, as long as you have at least a little bit of peel, like, you can sacrifice half your health bar to, you know, chunk out an Alistair or to chunk out a Yone before a big fight starts around Grubs or around Dragon. Like, it's a super valuable trade almost 90% of the time, as we're seeing globally, and Upset, I think, does that better than almost any AD carry in the West right now. Razork was unkillable on Maokai. This champion was, like, genuinely unbeatable in the back half of this game. They could not break through that health bar. Humanoid was good. Mickey X was really good, specifically on the Rel. You know, again, like, I'll say this about the Elise, I continue to believe that this champion only works if you are significantly better than the team that you're playing into. Of course, Fnatic is significantly better than Team Heretics. Like, you have to get such a gigantic lead, and you have to not really care that you're playing 4v5 in the back half of the game, but Fnatic could probably win this 3v5 if they really had to, because they are just, like, 4 tiers above Team Heretics in terms of their skill level. So again, overall, pretty standard win for Fnatic. Kind of the expected outcome, but they did it in a way that I think was really encouraging. And then for Heretics on the other side, they're just not good enough to be going up against a team like Fnatic and actually hold their own. They got obliterated. And the players that have been struggling continue to struggle. The players that have been fine continue to be fine. Like, it's a pretty easy analysis, I'll say, for Heretics at this point in terms of what they are. Carlson is a very easy choice for dead of the series. Was awful. I mean, just, like, absolutely horrendous. Like, one of the worst series that we've seen. That Yasuo game in Game 2 was genuinely one of the worst games that we have seen in the LEC all year long. He's just not a particularly great player. We kind of knew this coming into the year. It was going to be a bit of a steep climb for him to be able to get used to playing at the LEC level. He's pretty clearly the worst top laner in the LEC. I think even when you look at, like, the bottom tier teams, like, even someone like GIANTX, I think, has more to offer in that regard. Even, you know, obviously someone like Adam, who's already out, has way more to offer in that regard. Carlson is just not a good player. He is really going to hold this team back on the top side of the map if they go up against teams that have, you know, really aggressive top sides, which Fnatic does have at the current moment. There's just no way he's going to be able to survive against those really mechanically talented players. He has not been impressive, unfortunately, at all. You know, Kamalu continues to really struggle in the mid lane. His good games look really good. I think people are going to get deceived by the fact that when he wins, he does do a good job at being able to, like, play through an advantage. And, like, if he has a gold lead at 15 minutes, he knows what to do with that. He's not, like, a dumb player or anything, but he's just not very good at, like, getting those leads in the first place. He's certainly not able to do it consistently against, like, the actual mid laners of the LEC, like Humanoid on the other side of this. He's been pretty outclassed basically every single time he's played anybody of even decent quality. Stend had a really rough series. It happens every so often. Like, I don't think he's been the problem on this team at all so far in 2025. Maybe that's just my preseason analysis coming back in, but really, I think him and Flacket have been the strength. Flacket has definitely been the best player on this team. Sheo's had good moments, but Razork is a better player basically in every aspect. Again, Team Heretics is just not the team that's going to be able to go up against Fnatic and actually be able to hold their own. Their solo laners are bad, like bottom of the barrel bad, worst in the league, kind of bad, or at least in contention for that, and the rest of the team is certainly not good enough to be able to carry them above that. You know, they're going to be happy if they win a game at all, I think, in these best of threes. I think they will probably be one of, if not the first team eliminated from the playoffs, but big win for Fnatic. They're going to be moving on to the next round. It certainly does not get easier from here. They take on the winner of the series that we're going to talk about next, G2 and GIANTX, which of course is a series we will cover in today's video, but it's neither of those matchups are going to be quite as simple as beating up on Team Heretics. If they end up facing G2, that's really going to determine a lot for us, and we'll talk about that, but at least for now, Fnatic carrying over their favorites kind of mentality from the regular season, showing that the #1 seed was very justifiably earned. But then moving on to our second round 1 series, and we already kind of talked about it a bit in the previous section, but it's G2 Esports taking on GIANTX, the #3 seeded G2 taking on the #6 seeded GIANTX. I probably should specify that. And it's gonna be G2 moving on. We are gonna get Fnatic versus G2. Death, Taxes, and Fnatic G2 are the only 3 constants in the entire universe. This was anticipated, as well as GX played for a majority of the regular season. It was clear that they were starting to have some problems, that when their bot lane wasn't completely popping off and dominating every single game, they didn't really have the same kind of firepower as a lot of the other top teams in the region. I still think that they are a good team, but G2 is catching up back to where they probably should have been. This team really struggled out of the gate, really didn't find a lot of the confidence and momentum that they thought they were going to get with their new roster, but as we predicted, it just took some time for them to figure out how they wanted to do things, and now it does feel like that version of G2 that we all really wanted to see is real and is coming out here. And you know what? It's the players that were added this offseason that continue to make pretty massive differences for G2. Skewmond is finally starting to get comfortable and starting to get a little bit more, I guess, adept at playing with the rest of this team. He's going to get yet another player of the series. He's picked up a couple of these over the past couple of weeks, players of the game, I guess, in these best of ones, but he's definitely played significantly better over the past, 2 weeks of games than he had at any point in the first couple of weeks. He was really struggling. Honestly, I feel like people are going to tunnel vision a bit, and I want to make this clear. I'm not trying to say that this is something we should hold over him, because the growth is awesome, and maybe he just needed to get his feet wet and get out of his own head and, get comfortable playing on stage, but people are going to forget that, the first 6 games that Skewmond played, he was like a bottom 2, bottom 3 jungler in the LEC. I see a lot of people talking about Rookie of the Year or Rookie of the Split conversations. That's trolling, in my opinion. If you actually believe that, it is just entirely based off of G2 being a team that you expect to do well. Skewmond has not been better than most of the other rookies in the league this year, but he is starting to figure things out. That is the truth. The Xin Zhao game in particular in game 2 was great. He was awesome on the Pantheon. In game #1, Panth in particular feels like a champion that really works with his style. He definitely is much more team fight focused than I think he is early game focused as a player. That was always the scouting report with him coming out of BDS Academy in the first place, but having something that is just so naturally able to control the map in the mid game, I think really does help speed up a lot of G2's decision making. We saw that in game 1. Xin Zhao offers something very similar, where it kind of forces you to play a lot more aggressive around these skirmishes, and it does speed things up. Overall, I just think Skewmond is, playing a lot more comfortable. That's the best way I can put it. It is clear that the talent was always there, that the mechanical skill was always there. I just think that, he's not trying to force the same kind of plays that he was at the start of the split, which I think is definitely increasing his floor, which is really nice for the rest of this team. And then, obviously, Caps was excellent here. There was a pretty big mid gap. I don't think that's necessarily reflective in the KDAs. Caps was way better than Jackie's in this series. Caps, honestly, you could give him player of the series, and I wouldn't bat an eye. This guy just continues to play up to any standard he needs to in order to make things happen. His trading ability and his, combat power is just so much higher than everybody else's. His ability to play out these skirmishes and even really duel 1v1 or 1v2 in a lot of circumstances, it's just better than basically anybody else in the league. It's ridiculous. We know that Caps is insane, but he continues to prove it every time. Labrov had a brilliant Mikhail's Blessing that really kind of saved the game for G2. I really want to give Labrov a shout out. He, alongside Skewmond, has also played significantly better in the back half of this year, or the back half of this split, than he had at the beginning, when he was really struggling to kind of find some, I guess, synergy with Hansama and Skewmond in particular. Hansama was good here. Getting Sivir to scale in game 2 is obviously a really big positive, just allowing him to get to 3 items. That was all they really needed in order to close out the game, and Broken Blade was definitely the better of these 2 top laners. He picked Warwick top. That's definitely a fun little pick, but overall, G2, not the most, unbelievable, crazy, impressive, dominant series of all time, but they were the better team, and, you are seeing incremental growth from this team that leads you to believe that they are on pace to still be what we thought G2 was going to be, which is the best team in the region. They're definitely still on that trajectory, especially with Skewmond and Labrov really starting to step up. And then for GX on the other side, they played fine. I honestly think their bot lane played really well. Noah was really good. throughout basically the entire series. He pulls out the Mel bot lane in game number 2. You know, I think Mel is one of those picks that, again, I'm still kind of on a wait-and-see approach with it in Pro, because we've seen it do well damage-wise in a lot of these fights, but it has, like, an absurdly low win rate at the Pro level right now, because obviously Mel is one of those champs that the higher you go in skill level, like, the less effective she generally is, because she only has one form of escape. She has no mobility. She has, like, the reflector, but, you know, good players can actually take advantage of that and can force it out early in fights and then use it to kind of bait in a lot of the other CC that you need to lock down the champion. You know, I'm just curious to see where it ends up going. Noah did make it look really strong here in game number 2, and he was great on the Varus in game 1 as well, but I just don't know how much of that is Noah being really good and how much of that is the champ being really good, because Noah has had a really good split. Jun continues to be really positive for the team. I don't think he's been quite as good as he was in week number 1, where he was just absolutely dominating everybody, but he still has been one of the better supports in the LEC over the past couple of weeks. It just sucks because the top side of this map was just a complete non-factor. They lost the game entirely. They lost the series entirely for GX. Lot, Closer, and Jackie's all just got completely outplayed. Whoever you want to give dud of the series to, it should go to one of these 3. Lot's going to get it for me because it was more obvious to me that he was getting outplayed mechanically against a lot of the rest of the G2 players, specifically Caps, in that 1v1 duel. Lot has struggled a lot more after week number 1 than I think a lot of the other rookies have. I think his start was so good that we kind of just expected him to be able to carry that through, but that has not necessarily been the case. Closer got completely outjungled by Skewmond. Not really a place that you want to see him. You want to see this matchup be at least kind of even with where Closer is at. That was not the case. And then we already talked about it. Jackie's was a lot worse, I think, than his scoreline would indicate in this series. He got completely outplayed not only by Caps, but by Lebrav and Skewmond as well. It just felt like he was always like 2 steps behind. Jackie's is the player that we're kind of waiting on to take that big leap into tier 1 in terms of talking about the upper echelon mid laners. That has not happened so far in winter. He's been good, but he's not necessarily been great. I would argue he's been worse than he was in summer of last year. Hopefully he can get some of that momentum back, but Noah and Jun were still fine. I still think this team has more than a shot to be able to make like top, 5 or 6, obviously, but top 4 is still within the cards. I think for GIANTX, it's just G2 is a really good team, and they were clearly better on the day. Skewmon and Lebrav coming along, Caps still being Caps, and even if Broken Blade still hasn't shown like the Broken Blade tendencies so far in 2025, this is still a team that you can expect to be favorites basically in any series, regardless of the form that they're in. But then moving on now to the bottom side of the bracket and our 2 first-round series on that side, and I'll be honest, this was the one I was most looking forward to in round 1, because I thought if there was going to be an upset, it would be here, but alas, expected outcome ahoy. It's Movistar KOI taking on Team BDS, number 4-seeded Movistar KOI taking on number 7-seeded BDS, and KOI is going to pick up the victory here. They are the better team, and they're going to win 2-0, although it was pretty contentious, I would say, in game number 2. BDS certainly, it was their game to lose, and they ended up losing it. But it's funny, we hyped up these best of 3 so much at the beginning of this stage because we were like, we're finally getting into Fearless, we're finally going to see some teams, get tested a little bit more, and yet here we are, our 3rd best of 3, and all 3 of them so far have gone 2-0. We will see how that continues through the rest of the video, but KOI kind of coming out and showing that they still deserve to be a part of that big 4 in the LEC right now. I think a lot of people are looking at it as such, where there are definitely 4 favorites and then kind of a cluster in the middle, a 3-team cluster in my opinion, in the middle, and then, some teams that aren't as competitive. KOI is definitely in that upper echelon right now, even if they're definitely a bit more inconsistent than maybe the other 3. So let's talk about it. Player of the series is kind of up to your own interpretation. One of these players was the most important player in this win, but he also had so many mistakes that I just don't know if I can justify giving him player of the series. That, of course, being Jojo Pyun in the mid lane. That Yone was incredibly good when it mattered in game 2, but like he made so many weird errors throughout this series that you just kind of, I can't give him player of the series as a whole. There was too much indecisiveness, too much, feast or famine nature to his game throughout the first 2 games, or throughout both of these 2 games, and so it's just not a player of the series worthy performance in my opinion. It's gonna go to Supa, who I thought maybe didn't have the same kind of highs that Jojo Pyun had, but was definitely more consistent over the course of the whole series. Supa's awesome. I mean, I got a lot of flack last year for defending Supa a ton, calling him my rookie of the year, saying that I thought he was the most valuable rookie across the entire year to his individual team, talking pretty highly about Mad Lions throughout basically the entirety of the year, even when they were struggling in the summer split. And you know what? That's aged incredibly well. Supa and Alvaro are one of the best bot lanes in the West, full stop. They do basically everything well. They can play really aggressive early in the 2v2. They're really solid at playing out lane swaps and generating advantages for late game and mid game skirmishes. Like, they can just kind of do whatever you need them to do in the current meta, and Supa is just a very versatile and very adept AD carry. He is good at every aspect of the game. His mechanics are great. He has a good head on his shoulders. He doesn't make ridiculous mistakes like some of his other teammates typically do. We'll talk about the middle of the map in a bit, but he has just turned into one of the most consistently great AD carries that Europe has. And, you know, I don't really know there's any other way to look at it at this point. This guy is super valuable to KOI, and Alvaro is obviously right alongside him. This bot lane has really become maybe the most consistent bot lane in the entire league. You know, obviously there are bot lanes right now with higher outputs. Players like Upset and Mickey, I think, are doing really well. You could point to the Corp bot lane performing really well, but I don't know if I would expect any of them to be as consistent throughout an entire year, regardless of the things that are happening as Supa and Alvaro. Like, that's how highly I view these two, and they continued to show up in this series here. Of course, you have to talk about JoJo. Nuke was really good on the other side of this matchup. How much of it was just like Nuke playing really well and then JoJo getting a chance to shine in the back half of these games? I guess that's kind of up to you, but his Yone ultimates were just simply better than everybody else's on BDS, and that's kind of what got this team over the top. His bad moments are still very much there, and the reason I've considered KOI kind of outside that upper echelon where, you know, I talked about it in the regular season, I said that Corp and Fnatic were the two best performing teams, and you have to assume that G2 is going to be able to be in there. The reason KOI didn't necessarily feel on that level to me is just because I don't really know what I'm going to get out of Elyoya and JoJo as a mid-jungle duo on a game-to-game basis. There could be a day where they pop off and completely destroy their opposition, even if it's like the best players in the league. Like, JoJo could destroy Caps, and that could be a pretty realistic outcome in my opinion, but you could also get circumstances where he just completely runs down laning phase and Elyoya has no idea how to play around it. It's just a very volatile middle of the map for KOI that does concern me, because you do have stability elsewhere. We already talked about the bot lane stability, but Mirwin has been awesome to start this year. I think he's honestly gone a bit under the radar. This is the best Mirwin has ever played in pro, in my opinion, because he is picking things like, you know, Cassante and Mbessa, and obviously those are, you know, the champions that a lot of people are pointing to, but he plays the Karma in game number 2 and still is able to pull out a lot of these weird range top, like, advantages. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is that he's combining the unpredictable nature of last year, where he was really able to succeed on a lot of those crazy, wacky top lane picks, and trying to add in some staple meta top laners to be able to, you know, at least play that style if he has to. That was the problem last year, is anytime he had to, like, blind pick, or if people, you know, kind of forced him to play a lot of these more meta top laners like Cassante, he just wasn't, like, unbelievably good at them. He actually wasn't good really at all on those champions, and I think just increasing the floor of his performances allows the good performances to stand out more. It's what we already talked about with someone like Oscar Rinnin. When decrease the severity of the bad games, then all of a sudden the median performance that you have rises, because those good games very much still exist, but if the bad games are just not as bad, if they are slightly better, then all of a sudden you're looking at a player that actually is a lot more valuable to the team. So I've been really excited about Mirwin and top lane in general for KOI. I think bot lane is super consistent. JoJo was invaluable to their success here, but again, it just comes at a cost with JoJo Pune, it would seem. If he can clean up those mistakes, like, this team can make a finals run. They could win the LEC. They have that kind of talent. They deserve to be up there with teams like Corp and Fnatic in terms of, you know, what their form has looked like so far this year. G2 obviously in that conversation as well. It's all just about being able to get that out on a game-to-game basis. This was a great encapsulation, in my opinion, of KOI, and honestly, this is a pretty good encapsulation of BDS in the sense that they are not the team they were last year. This is a team that is okay at being able to skill check the opposition, because Nuke is really good, and because 113's early games are fine, like Irrelevant can hold his own in the laning phase, but unlike last year where they were probably the most surgical and clinical late game team in the entire league, mostly revolving around how Ice and Labrov ended up playing as a bot lane duo, like, they are awful in the later half of the game in 2025. I just don't really know why it has changed so much. I think obviously losing Labrov in that area definitely hurts, and maybe even losing someone like Sheo, who is definitely more of a teamfight focused player, like, hurts in that respect as well, but their late games are falling apart. The fact that they lost game number 2 is entirely their fault, and it's mostly just bad execution in these team fights, and that's just the opposite of what you would have expected from BDS going into the year. Dud of the series to me is pretty obviously going to go to Irrelevant, not because he didn't have resources, but because he did nothing with those resources. The missed Rumble ults in game number 2 were driving me up the wall. It is just unacceptable unacceptable, and quite frankly, Irrelevant has had a pretty unacceptable start to 2025. You brought him in because you thought he was going to be Adam without all of the off-the-rift drama, about the behind-the-scenes problems that Adam ended up having. Well, Irrelevant has been significantly worse than Adam so far to start 2025. Not only the Adam that you had last year in terms of the performance he gave you, but the Adam that is on Rogue and kind of hard stuck right now. Irrelevant has just not been a good player. He's been a bottom 3 or 4 top laner, certainly a bottom half top laner in the league, and that's just not really what you signed him to be. This is supposed to be a guy who's closer to top 3 than he is to bottom 3, and that is just very much not the case right now. Mirwin completely outplayed him, and honestly, he outplayed himself. He just wasn't very good in the back half of these fights. You could say similar things about players like Paris, who I think also played really poor in this series. I still really like Paris, and he was starting to find his footing. This is a hard series to play out, but he has not been the immediate impact on BDS that I honestly thought he was going to be. I thought he was going to be able to come into this team and immediately make them better, and he just hasn't been able to do that. 113, kind of back to struggling. He had an awesome final week of the regular season. I'm willing to cut him a bit of slack, mostly just because I think that he has more in the gas when he's not playing champions like Maokai in game number 2, but Nuke continues to be awesome. Like, this is a borderline top 5 player in the LEC right now. I don't know how many people are talking about that. He has continued to carry over that positive success that he had at the end of 2024 into 2025. Like, I talked about it a lot last year. I thought Nuke really broke out in 2024 because to me, he had always been a good, not great player with not great upside. Like, he was just a high floor mid laner that you could kind of rely on if you had good teammates around him, but he was a centralizing piece for why BDS was relevant for a majority of the end of last year, and he has been excellent to start off 2025. It just doesn't really matter if the rest of the team is going to let him down. Ice is really, really passive, and that style worked for them last year when they were good in the team fight stage, but now the rest of the team is kind of falling apart in these 5v5s, and Ice's big advantage can't be taken advantage of. Paris and 113 aren't playing perfect, and Irrelevant has just kind of been bad on the top side. BDS is a flawed team. I still think that there is room for them to grow into being top 4 or top 5, even by the end of winter. Like, if they can go on a lower bracket run, I think that that's totally realistic for them, but they do have definite issues that they need to figure out, and not a lot of them are just like, oh, we're playing against good teams, so we're getting outclassed there. A lot of it is self-inflicted, which is more concerning to me, but nice win for KOI. Still not sold on their consistency, as I've talked about at length here, but the bot lane and the top lane look excellent right now for them. I think they are going to be a dangerous team to, I guess, face as we move forward into these best of 3s and these best of 5s eventually if they ever get there, but again, as I said earlier for Fnatic, it definitely does not get easier in round number 2. They are definitely going to have a tougher competition moving forward with the other top 4 teams, and that's going to be the real test of where they're at. But then moving on to our 4th and final of the upper bracket round 1 matchups, and again, I kind of expected this outcome, but it was a little bit closer and a little bit different than I was anticipating. It was K-Corp taking on Team Vitality, and K-Corp is going to pick up the 2-0 win. They are the better of these two teams. If BDS couldn't win a game against KOI, then I don't think anybody else was going to be avoiding the sweep in round number 1. That's just kind of the expectation with the top 4 right now in the LEC, and K-Corp does live up to that, although Vitality definitely makes them work for it. A couple of really nice performances from the young rookies in the solo lanes for Vitality. Both Knock-Knocko and Chayak, I think, played really well in this series across both games, especially game number 2. Chayak doing a lot of really interesting things on the Victor. Knock-Knocko's just so mechanically talented that he can even play from bad situations, but it was the weak links of the team, in this case Linsas and Hillisang, that really held Vitality back, that really made this series unwinnable for them. And for K-Corp, they are just clicking on all cylinders. They are really, really good at beating bad teams, and obviously I want to know what that translates to when you start facing off against the top 4, but we're going to find out pretty shortly as we talk about the round 2 series at the end of this video, so I'm excited for that, but really the biggest point of excitement right now is just how good this bot lane is for K-Corp. Kalist and Targamas, who is going to get my player of the series. Targamas was excellent here. He's been really great all split long, to be entirely honest. Like, Kalist has definitely been better. Like, he's definitely stood out a bit more, at least in terms of the tape for me, but Targamas has gone from being not only the worst support in the league last year, but arguably the worst player in the league last year, and honestly kind of being similar when he had that one split shot on Excel in 2023, like having 2 straight years of just being a net negative for your team, to coming into this situation and being the handpicked support by Kalist, your big star prospect coming up, and living up to the expectation for this bot lane to actually be really great, going and outplaying Hillisang in a best of 3. It's really impressive stuff from Targamas. Obviously a lot of it is probably mental and communication oriented. Targamas Targamas has always been a very macro-oriented player. He doesn't really have good mechanics, and even in games like this, like, you're not seeing him just, like, completely outplay people in the same way that you would see someone like Hylissang completely outplay people in a positive way, but you are seeing him be in the right place at the right time to be able to set up the rest of his team. This just was a support gap, and it was in favor of Targamas. The fact that that sentence even exists against Hylissang is a pretty massive sentence for K-Corp, because it does open up so many more opportunities. Of course, you also need to shout out Kaliste, because he was excellent at being able to take advantage of the resources that were generated by Targamas, by Yike, by, you know, Kana on the top side. These games were over, I would say, pretty quickly. Game 2 was definitely, you know, more back and forth, but Kaliste did a very good job of being able to be the insurance policy in the back half of these games, and he's just been awesome. He's everything that everybody has cracked him up to be, and then some. He's been an amazing rookie AD carry, and I'm excited to see where he goes from here. He was better than Carzzy, who actually played pretty well in this series. Yike completely gapped Linsauce in the jungle. Like, this scoreline doesn't even indicate just how bad this was for Linsauce. I think in Game 2, with that Zyra versus Sedge matchup, I actually think Yike was up 7,000 gold individually. Like, it was something ridiculous. It was like 4 full levels. It was unreal. Like, you don't get jungle leads like that just naturally. That it has to come from something completely unreal, and that's exactly what Yike was able to do. He did everything perfectly. Linsauce played these games absolutely miserably, took some really bad fights, got himself in some really bad positions, and all of a sudden the game had spiraled completely out of control for Linsauce, and Yike is really good at that. This guy is one of the best junglers in the West. I think he continues to prove that, and he is probably the reason why I'm so confident that K-Corp is, like, pretty clear-cut a top 3 team in the LEC, mostly just because I feel so good about Yike in the jungle. Kana has arguably been the best top laner in the LEC so far to start 2025. I think that carried over here. He continues to show that his mechanics are just kind of better than everybody else's. Nocko, like I said, did a good job to stay relevant in these games, regardless of how well Kana was playing on the other side, but Kana is a beast, and he is just, like, he's locking in right now. This is way better than what we saw from him last year when he joined K-Corp, and somehow, someway, once again, I'm talking about Vladi last on this team. Chayak was excellent on the other side of this, and Vladi was not the main character, as he hasn't really been for K-Corp over the course of this split, but he's been awesome as, like, this secondary carry mid laner, this more facilitative type of mid laner that can play for Kaliste, that can play for Yike, that can play for Kana, you know, kind of play within the structure of the team. K-Corp just has a really nice roster construction, because I do think they have players that are willing to take that back seat to allow the others to shine. They don't just need to rely on being able to outskill everybody in every single lane in order to win games. They can do that. They have the talent to be able to do that, but you have a lot of, like, really synergistic play styles on this team, and I think it's really, really working right now. Targamas stepping up and actually being a really good support for this team, it just increases the floor and the ceiling for this team by so much that I'm really excited to see where they go. And then for Vitality on the other side, like, this is a Vitality-esque performance. I wasn't expecting them to come out and win this series. They might be the best of the rest. Like, I really do think, like, them, GIANTX, BDS, they're all within the same cluster, because they all kind of struggle with similar things. Not identical, but they all have flashes of brilliance that they just can't sustain, and somebody on the team is always kind of running it down. And in this case, it was Hylissang in the support position. Now, Hilly has been their carry, I would argue, over the beginning part of this split. Basically, every single game that they have won in the regular season was off the back of Hylissang just being so proactive in the support position. But this is what happens when you take that style and give the other team a lot of prio and a lot of pressure, and take away a lot of the ability for Hylissang to actually go out and make plays. You don't really have a lot of secondary answers. You don't have a lot of ways to catch up in that circumstance, and that's what we saw. Even with Carzzy playing okay in this series, Hylissang was completely running it. It's very similar to what we've talked about in the LCK with someone like Lehens, where when he's the best player on the Rift, when he can go out and do everything that he wants to do, it looks really good. When he has to play against, like, full good teams that are kind of taking away a lot of the easy pressure, he can sometimes look horrible, and that's kind of just what Hylissang is. It's what he's always been. You learn to live with it. Linsauce was awful. I honestly considered giving him dud of the series, but Hylissang was so bad that he kind of necessitated it, but Linsauce would have got this 9 times out of 10 in most circumstances. Carzzy was fine, like I said. Chayak was excellent. Chayak was definitely the best player on Vitality in this series, and most of that, I think, was Vladi not being main character-esque for K-Corp, just that being the lane that is allowed to be the highest priority for Vitality, but Chayak still had to come out and kind of prove that he could capitalize on that, and that's exactly what he did. I thought he played really well. Nocnocko, again, continues to show flashes of having elite mechanics, like genuinely elite mechanics, and just needs to clean up on a lot of the other stuff. Vitality still has stuff to, like, work around, and they're going to be going down into the lower bracket, I think, with a chance to be able to win a best of 3 or 2 and potentially get themselves into top 4 if everything were to go right. Right now, I would kind of bet against that. I think top 4 feels pretty solidified, and Vitality just don't feel like they're in that conversation, especially if Linsauce is not going to be able to keep up. Like, Hylissang is very flippy. You're not going to expect a performance like this every single time. There are going to be better showings from Hylissang, but if Linsauce is just getting gapped by good junglers this easily, it's kind of doomed for Vitality. There's just no way for them to be able to keep up with the actually good team, so I think he is going to be a big pivot point for what Vitality can do, but at least for now, I'm not, like, full panicking. The solo laners and especially looked good, and then, again, for K-Corp, they are super well-rounded, and as you know on this channel, I really like teams that don't rely on one style in order to kind of force victories in that way. It's why I think a team like BDS last year just wasn't all that successful, because they could only really win through one way. I think K-Corp can win through so many different ways. They are arguably just as versatile as a team like Fnatic or G2 is at the top of the standings, and, you know, they're right up there talent-wise. Yike is looking incredible. Kana looks insane. Vladi has been awesome as that, you know, secondary carry facilitative mid. Kalista has been everything he's been cracked up to be, and Targamas is having the best split right now that he's ever had. This is looking great for K-Corp. This is genuinely a team that can compete not only for top 3, but for top 1. But now that we've wrapped up round number 1, let's go ahead and jump into our upper bracket round number 2 matchups. These are the 2 series, I guess, the 2 best of 3s that are going to determine which 2 teams go to winners finals, make it to the top 3 guaranteed. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. These are gigantic series for all 4 teams that are involved to win, and obviously only 2 can move on, but this is going to determine quite a lot. These are probably the 2 most interesting matchups we could have gotten, and we're going to be starting on the upper side. The first 2 winners from today's video. It's the number 1 seeded Fnatic taking on the number 3 seeded G2 Esports. And of course, G2 is able to pick up the victory here. Of course, they're going to be moving on to winners finals. And of course, they do it in a 2-0 sweep. I can't even be surprised by this. Like, quite frankly, I can't even sit here and be shocked. Fnatic has looked like the best team for the entirety of the regular season, but it's G2, and it's G2 specifically versus Fnatic. It feels like this is just a mental block that Fnatic has trouble overcoming, and it once again rears its ugly head here. Fnatic has looked better than they have looked in years so far to start off 2025, at least in my opinion. I think this is the most interesting version of Fnatic we've gotten in quite a long time, and yet it is still not enough to take down the kings of Europe. And it's for a lot of different factors. I think you can point to a lot of different things. Most notably, I think G2 just played the map better. It's so strange because Fnatic was probably the best macro team so far in 2025 in the regular season, in round number 1. It felt like they had the best grasp of what this new map was like, but going up against G2, I guess, just causes your brain to completely melt because now they're starting Otacon and, you know, getting Shred, and G2 comes in and is able to ace them and is just able to completely take control because Fnatic just doesn't have the pressure to be able to do and get away with the things that they're trying to do. Like, I get you want to be aggressive as this team, but you got to make smart plays, and Fnatic just wasn't really doing that, and it threw them the game, especially in game number 1. But even in game number 2, that wasn't an out-of-control game or anything. They had a real shot to be able to win that, and they just couldn't quite hang on. Player of the series was kind of difficult because I do think that the player who, kind of similarly to what we talked about with KOI in round 1, the player who made the biggest highlight plays probably was too inconsistent to get player of the series. That, of course, being Caps in the mid lane. He was the one really doing a lot of the big, gigantic 1v2s or catching people out in positions they shouldn't be in. A lot of that was Fnatic basically giving that over to G2, but I ended up leaning in the same way that I did in the KOI series, which is leaning on the side of consistency, so player of the series is going to go to Hansama for me. He is turning on playoff form. Like, if there is one thing you can start to get consistent with, like mentality-wise with G2 and with the players in Europe, it's that Hansama will look average in the regular season, he will look below average internationally, and he will be unbelievably good domestically in the playoffs. It's weird. He comes alive in these domestic playoffs and really starts to take over games for G2. They start playing for him more. It's been super consistent over the last 2 years that this has been the strategy that they've wanted to employ, is not necessarily playing for him in, you know, other moments in the regular season or at Worlds or MSI, but playing for him in these best of 3s and in these best of 5s in the LEC. It's definitely intriguing and weird, but Hansama almost always comes through with it. He was really good and really consistent across this whole series. The scoreline does indicate that. Didn't take a ton of ridiculous risks, but was doing a ton of damage in teamfights just as a backline carry. Again, Caps probably was the one making the biggest like standout play, specifically on the Aurora in game number 1, where it felt like he was just playing super greedy and super aggro basically every single time he could. He ends up blind picking Azir in game number 2, which as we all know is Humanoid's weakness, and it ends up being a bit of a problem for Fnatic to be able to answer to. Caps was excellent, and if you wanted to give him player of the series, I do understand that. Skewmond had a phenomenal week. I think he continues to really be a driving force for where G2 is at right now. Again, his ability to upgrade where he was just a couple of weeks ago to where he is now, like just being good enough to allow the rest of the team to be able to take over. That's all he needs to do, let alone, you know, play things like Pantheon and actually be relevant in a lot of these fights and be a good frontliner on Maokai. You have Broken Blade continuing to pull out some of the weirder top laners. Again, he's still a little bit off to me in terms of the production and the performance, but I'm not going to criticize him too much. Labrov had a really good weekend. Overall, G2 is feeling so much more like the G2 we expected, and the one we all kind of wanted to see coming into the LEC. This is still the team to beat in Europe, and I think they made that abundantly clear here, and unfortunately, Fnatic is the victims of that. It's really sad to see a team that did so well in the regular season, that felt like they were finally going to be able to compete for that top 1, just kind of throw it all away in a best of 3. Now, it's not all like doom and gloom for Fnatic. They could win out from here on out and win the LEC and go to first stand. I still think that's, you know, a realistic possibility. It's within the realm of possibility at the very least, but I think some of their flaws definitely got exposed here. I mean, their aggressive shot calling tendencies are exploitable by teams that are just able to outfight them in these instances, and they sometimes are going to get in their own way. They did that in major moments in previous iterations of this team as well, and so I'm not really surprised to see this turn out, especially with the individual players here. Dud of the series could go to quite a few people. I'm going to give it to Mickey X, although I really wanted to give this to Humanoid. He just made too many good plays for me to give it to him. I think he was super relevant across both of these games, but he also made gigantic mistakes, and quite frankly, him not being as good as Caps, specifically on the Ahri in game number 2, is kind of something that really held them back across this series. And again, it's just Humanoid not being able to show up when it matters the most. It's been a pretty consistent trend for him over the past couple of years here in the LEC, but I am giving it to Mickey X mostly because he was the one that was just going in and dying in a lot of these bad instances. It is clear that he is the primary shot caller on this team, that he is the one that's going to be making a ton of the late game decisions. Him and Razork, I think, do kind of share that responsibility, but he was calling for a lot of things that clearly were problematic here. The macro did lose Fnatic game number 1. I blame that a little bit on Mickey, and it's not like the engages were significantly better. The Rel in particular was not great in game number 2, and so he's going to get dead of the series, but if you wanted to give to Humanoid, that's fair. I think Razork got out-jungled here by Skewmon, just didn't have the same kind of pressure. Oscar was fine. I think Upset was actually really fine. Like, he got completely abandoned, you know, very Upset style by his team in a lot of these fights. Upset actually played these games really well, and I do think he's still in a really good spot, like maybe the best AD carry in Europe right now in terms of production, but it just wasn't enough. If you're going to make bad decisions against a team as good as G2, you are going to fall. You are not going to be able to win series like that, and that just was the case for Fnatic here. Again, they still have a lot of ability to bounce back. They're not out of the tournament or anything. They're going down into the lower bracket. They're going to have to go through a couple more best of 3s to even make the best of 5 stage, but if you can get back to the finals, like one more best of 5 against a team like G2 is super winnable for Fnatic. They are good enough. We have seen what this team can look like at their best, and this, unfortunately, just was not it. Hopefully they can learn and grow from that and use that momentum to get themselves back into a position where they can challenge again. But for G2 on the other side, huge win. I mean, just solidifying themselves back at the top of the standings, saying that, nah, we were just ramping up. We were just warming up. We've done this before. We've started 1 and 2. We've, you know, been below 500 and then figured things out, gone undefeated in the playoffs, and just shown that Europe is easy to win for us. That could be the case once again. This team is peaking at the right moment. I'm still a little bit concerned about some individual players, most notably Broken Blade, who I'm just kind of waiting to have that big pop-off performance. Not that he's been a problem, just that I don't think he's been as much of a strength as he usually is for G2, but everything else is clicking. Caps is clearly in, like, Mamba mentality mode, like, I'm gonna carry the game mode. Skewmond and Labrov are coming around. Hansama is activating playoff form. Things are going right for G2, and that's going to advance them to the best of 5s. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the weekend here, and our second of these round 2 matchups that qualify somebody for winners finals. Who's going to be taking on G2? Well, it was a matchup between the number 2 seeded Corp and the number 4 seeded Movistar KOI, a big rivalry. and K-Corp is going to come out on top. And if the Fnatic G2 series was a 2-0, but was kind of close, Fnatic having a lot of opportunities to be able to fight back, like that rivalry clearly, meant something, and, those players stepped up and tried. This was a complete stomp. This was a complete blowout. This was not even particularly close. This was K-Corp absolutely decimating KOI and making this look not even a conversation. We were talking about KOI after that first round matchup where it's like, I've kind of kept them out of the top 3, but a win, especially like a good showing in round 2 would definitely put them not only in like top 4, but like top 2, top 3 conversations. They could be a team that I'm really looking at. No, it is clear. K-Corp is in the upper echelon of teams. They are a full tier above a team like KOI at the current moment with what they are. And that shows on tape, that shows in terms of the consistency of these rosters, not only from this series, but throughout the entirety of the winter split, in my opinion. We can go ahead and talk about it, but really, like, you can point to anybody on this team and talk about, like, the advantages and the pluses that K-Corp has over a lot of other teams. Kalista is going to get my player of the series, but if you wanted to give this to Targamas once again in the support position, that is totally fine. I think it pretty much has to go to one of the 2 bot lane members, but it's not like Yike wasn't excellent. It's not like Kana, it doesn't look like the best top laner in the league. Vladi is, like, the single best weak side facilitative mid, and he gets better every single game. He went up against Jojo Pume and just completely outplayed him in laning phase. Like, this team is just so good across the board. They don't have a single player that is not playing at an elite level right now, and that's insane considering the roster makeup. So we obviously can talk about it, but like, how do you not give player of the game to Kalista, or player of the series to Kalista? I get that Targamas was excellent. The Poppy, the Renata, they looked unbelievable, but this guy is like legitimately unreal. His mechanics are better than everybody else in the region, imports included. He is truly like the savior of Europe. At least that's what he looks like right now. I'm not going to try and anoint him too early. One of the most fun trends that we talked about in the primer video when, we talked about K-Corp and talked about what their upside could be is that like Kalista, there's not really been a prospect that's come in with this much like hype around him from an international like expectation standpoint. Like, he's supposed to be the best AD carry in the region from day one, and I just didn't know how he was going to be able to handle that. He wasn't going to be given a grace period. He wasn't going to be given time to kind of level up or to get better, and he was playing with Targamas, who was coming off of a horrible split, like the worst player in the LEC type of split, and I just didn't know if he was going to be as good as people thought he was going to be from day one, because I didn't see him as like generationally different in the same way that like, Caps was when he came up in the LEC or in the EULCS many years ago. I was wrong. I'm happy to say that this guy is everything that every positive person could possibly have said about him, just encapsulated. This guy knows exactly what he's supposed to do. His Kalista is like generationally good, and he just completely gapped Supa and Alvaro, who are one of the best bot lanes in Europe. Like, this wasn't even remotely close. It's absurd how good Kalista is, and hopefully he's going to be able to carry it through. I imagine there are going to be some stumbling blocks, but the fact that he has shown this level of talent on tape so far, it's actually just ridiculous. Like, it is genuinely unfair. Targamas obviously does a lot to help for that. Like, this bot lane is unreal good, and they have absolutely no reason to be as good as they are. The fact that Targamas is gapping Alvaro, like, this is a support diff in this series, is just unreal if you would have told me that last year. Like, it feels like it's an entirely different player in there from what not only it was in 2024, because obviously that was bad, but he was bad in 2023. Like, it's been years since Targamas has even looked like a passable LEC caliber support, and here he is looking like one of the best in the entire league. Yike is a menace. Like, everything good I said about Yike last year, where I was talking about him as if, him and Caps were 1A, 1B, like he was a top 3 player in the LEC, and, people kind of argued me on that. It's back. Like, the winter split version of Yike is super legit, and it's super here because he is just unreal in the jungle right now. Easily, in my opinion, the best jungler in the LEC. Like, Razork has been exceptionally good, but Yike has been unreal good for K-Corp. I think it really is a 2-horse race in that regard. If you want to go in, the favor of Razork, I think that that's entirely fair, but Yike has been good enough to, at the very least, be, like, close to 50-50 in that conversation. Kana's the best top laner in the league. I don't even think it's remotely close. His mechanics are just better than everybody else's. Mirwin has been having the best split of his career, and he played the 2 champions. He just played to, like, super big success in round number 1, and Kana just completely outplayed him. And Vladi, like, I don't want to undersell Vladi. I feel like sometimes it feels disrespectful to talk about him the way that I do, because I talk about him as if he's like this guy who's just like a 3rd or 4th option and, not super relevant to the team. That's not what I mean to say when I say that he's like a great facilitative piece. What I mean to say is that he is like the 3rd or 4th option on this team, and the fact that someone as good as Vladi is the 3rd or 4th option, first of all, is fantastic, but the fact that he is so comfortable playing that role is insane coming out of the mid lane. So many mid laners struggle without the resources resources, but Vladdy is like perfect without resources. He is the ideal mid laner for a team full of stars because he can just win his lane by himself and be super useful in the mid to late game around these skirmishes, around these team fights. He's just so adaptable, and he's so perfect for what K-Corp want to do. This roster is just stacked from top to bottom right now. Everybody is performing at a ridiculous level, and if they can keep this up, like, legit, this is a team that can win the LEC without a lot of problems. And then for KOI, if there was a concern about whether or not this team was like in the top 3 or like a part of that big group at the top, I think this kind of dashes that. This is a team that is definitely better than a lot of the mediocre teams like Vitality and BDS and GIANTX. Like, it's clear that KOI is a better team than them, but they are not on the level of the teams that are expected to compete to win the league. Teams like K-Corp and Fnatic and G2, they are a tier below them, unfortunately, right now, and I think this series does kind of prove that. They were not even close. They got absolutely obliterated. They got kind of embarrassed, and it was in every way. You can't really point to one individual player being significantly worse than the rest. Bot lane was obviously the biggest gap. Whether you want to give dud of the series to Supa or Alvaro, it should go to one of those two. I'm giving it to Alvaro just because I think he was a little bit worse, but Supa was awful. Both of them got completely outplayed. Kaliste was way better than Supa, specifically in Game 2, and Alvaro just didn't get to do anything throughout this entire series. JoJo was outplayed by Vladdy 1v1 and then never got to be aggressive really at all throughout the rest of this series. JoJo was brought in because of his mechanical ability, and getting outplayed by someone like Vladdy with no resources is just not good enough. Like, Elyoya was, I guess, fine, probably the least problematic on the team, but Mirwin losing to Kana, it's not like Elyoya didn't get out-jungled by Yike, and it's not like Yike didn't have full control of the entire map. It just was a horrible, horrible look for KOI, and they're going to have to go down to the lower bracket now and prove that they deserve to raise their stock again. This does take them out of that top 3 conversation for me. This does kind of take them out of that tier conversation, even with a team like Fnatic who already lost. Like, I think they are worse than those teams, and even if they are better than, you know, Vitality and BDS and a lot of these other teams in the middle, GIANTX, like, I don't know how much better and if it's going to matter. This team needs to prove that they can compete with the upper echelon because you did not sign this team coming off of a Worlds appearance, bringing in JoJo Pune in order to just be the 4th best team in the LEC. They need to be better than what they are, and especially against a rival, this is entirely embarrassing and definitely a disappointing outcome. But what a gigantic win for K-Corp. They are the real deal, and I'm so excited for their best of 5 against G2. They're in the top 3. Guaranteed. They are getting at minimum 3rd place if they lose every other game for the rest of this entire split. But this is a team that absolutely can win the LEC. I think that series against G2 is going to tell us a lot. If they can stand toe-to-toe with G2, I feel pretty good about them being like a top 2 team in the league, you know, right up there with Fnatic, but we'll have to see. If they, you know, can somehow pick up a victory in winners finals, that certainly makes the conversation more interesting. A lot is going to be determined for K-Corp next week in that winners finals, but the fact that they're even here is honestly just so fun. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LEC Winter Split Playoff Round Number 1 overview and analysis video. Of course, it's kind of upper bracket round number 2, but weekend number 1 I think is kind of the encompassing term that we should probably be using. We know our first 2 teams to qualify for the best of 5 stage for the top 3, for that matter, that being, of course, G2 and K-Corp that are immediately slotted into winners finals. All you have to do is win 2 best of 3s to get to the best of 5 stage, and G2 and K-Corp were able to do that undefeated, therefore they get the advantage going into the next stage. Of course, Movistar KOI and Fnatic still in a pretty decent spot. They only have to win 1 best of 3 left in order to get to that best of 5 stage, but it will be a 4th place game. And then you've got your lower bracket round number 1 matchups where we could see some teams eliminated, we could see some teams start to generate some momentum. Let's go ahead and talk about basically all of the matchups that we are going to see next weekend and what I'm expecting from them. Starting, of course, with our lower bracket round 1. We have Team Heretics and GIANTX on the top side here. This is the easier of the 2, in my opinion. This should feel pretty in favor of GIANTX. I think they are definitely the better of these 2 teams. I think bot lane is kind of the strength for Heretics. Flacket has definitely been their best player, but GIANTX's bot lane is just better. Noah and Jun have been better over the course of this year, and I do think the solo laners are a gigantic problem for Heretics. Jackies versus Camelou feels like a matchup that is very much not in favor of Heretics, and you could say a similar thing even about the rookie Lot, who has struggled recently against Carlson on the top side. So I would expect GIANTX to not struggle too much with this series and to move on to take on Movistar KOI. And then for the second of the lower bracket round 1 series, it's Team BDS taking on Team Vitality. This one is way more interesting in terms of the preview because I think both of these teams are very close in terms of skill level. I would assume that BDS should be the better of these two teams, and I am going to stick with that in terms of a prediction, but I don't think that the difference between them is all that gigantic. I think Nuke is probably the best player on the Rift when these two teams play, and that should separate things at least a little bit, and if Irrelevant can just survive against Knock Knocko on the top side, then I don't know if Vitality have the firepower, but if Hylissang just completely outplays Paris, which I don't think is out of the realm of possibility, like Vitality has ways to play through bot lane and ways to be able to win that matchup, but for now, I'm going to trust Nuke, I'm going to trust BDS, and I'm going to trust that they're going to be moving forward, even if I do think it's a pretty close series. That would leave Movistar KOI to take on GIANTX, and it would leave Fnatic to take on BDS. I think KOI and Fnatic are favorites. Like, basically, no matter who they end up facing, KOI is definitely the team of those two that I am the least confident in, but GIANTX I don't think is quite as, you know, interesting as BDS is on paper, in my opinion, when you get into these best of threes. And so, you know, KOI versus GIANTX, I would expect KOI to be able to win that. And same thing for Fnatic versus BDS or Vitality. I think it will be BDS, but Fnatic should have really no trouble with either of those two teams. That one I feel even better about. So I would have KOI and Fnatic moving on to that 4th place matchup. And then for the winners finals, G2 taking on Corp. Boy, has this become a very interesting matchup because G2 looks really great. They look like the best version that they've had all year long, but Corp has indeed looked better over the course of this split. I think that that is an entirely fair thing to say when you just look at the tape and look at the quality of game. Like, Corp has looked better than maybe anybody else in the LEC, Fnatic included, and I don't know if I want to trust that, right? Like, it's hard to know whether or not to bet against G2. I'm going to stick to my guns and say that G2 is better. It's just impossible to bet against them, but I think Corp could be better than Fnatic. I think this could be a team that moves on to finals, and, you know, even if they, like, win here, like, I'm not guaranteeing that G2 would be doomed and that they couldn't just win semifinals and then come back and win finals or anything like that, but for now, you know, the G2 undefeated road is alive until proven otherwise, and, you know, they've done this over and over and over again. I have to believe in the players, and I have to believe in the org. I think G2 will be moving on to grand finals, but let me know if you agree or disagree with that down in the comments section below. Do you think it will be KOI and Fnatic moving out of the lower bracket? Do you think G2 will be beating Corp, or do you have more faith in Corp than I do? It's not that I don't have faith in them, it's just that I think I have too much faith in G2 to ever really bet against them. Would love to know your thoughts and opinions down below, but that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the rest of the LEC playoffs on this channel as we always do, but for Stands right around the corner, we're covering all 3 of the other major regions as well, so LTA, LCK, and LPL, all of them are in their playoff structures right now, and we're covering them either later this week, or, you know, we already covered some LCK, we'll be covering it even more later on in the week. There's a lot to go over for all of the playoffs. LPL playoffs start very shortly, and so I'm very excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when all of those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all